Dave, over to you.
I was just going to say we weren't quite on the hour. I was waiting till 11. I was waiting till on the hour before we started. So I think Adrian, you're not muted at the moment.
Oh, let me mute.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to day 5 by my count. So as Ross said just before we started formally, this morning we'll be looking at the subject to issues on ED77 and then going back to ED76 to walk through the changes that John's made on that. And also in particular, we'll have a look at the basis for conclusions because there's new material there that we haven't seen before. Those haven't been reordered as yet, but we still need to work our way through the new material for the first time. So I think with Dave, sorry, I should say that we will only be dealing with ED77 and ED76 this morning, as we dealt with revenue yesterday. So without further ado, Dave, over to you to introduce the issue.
Thanks, Ian. So a little different from what we did last week because we just circulated the issues papers. We don't have slides and they're all in Word format, so I won't be putting anything up unless something comes up where we want a diagram or something. So I'll dive right into issue 1. What is current service value? I don't think I'll have much to say on any of the issues because, as I said, we've just talked about them and they're fairly short, concise issues papers. I'll say the only revelation for me here was listening to the board's discussion. What became evident actually when I was writing issue paper 3 was that I was using service potential to try to get across the concept of current use. And that's why I was pushing on valuing service fairly heavily in the last version. Listening to the board's comments last week, I thought backing off service potential and moving more to current use was actually a more direct way to get to the valuation staff was trying to communicate previously. So our recommendation is to update the objective to focus more on current use and back away from service potential.
Thanks, Dave. So here we're focusing on the definition. We'll look at the term itself as the next item. So if I can have any comments on staff proposals in particular, anybody disagree with what staff is proposing and that shift in emphasis? Yeah, so I've got Camira, Patricia and Mike.
Thanks, Chair. Well, I disagree with the staff proposal on focusing on current use because, well, in part, I think it's on the one hand, it's a complex estimation because now the current use, as the way we are defining it, we are not looking only at the current use at the measurement date, but we are also looking at the expected use over the useful life of the asset. So it makes it a bit more complex from the prepared perspective. In the arguments that the staff is providing to us, so I agree in the sense of, okay, disregarding the potential alternative use because it solves the problem, but when you say that we are disregarding as well any other characteristics of the asset, I disagree with that because I think the public sector is accountable for those assets, and if we do not recognize them as they are, then yeah, there is a huge risk there. Another point is that the use of an asset is too entity specific and it can change from one entity to other. And if you compare that with the qualitative characteristics in the conceptual framework, so let's say as a current use, okay, it's relevant, yes, but in terms of faithful representation, I have some doubts because if we have a building, let's say a 3 floors building, and there's one entity that is using only 1 floor, it seems like we are asking the evaluation expert just to close their eyes and think that that building has only 1 floor. So we are disregarding the characteristics of the asset, and that could be very harmful, I think. And also in terms of comparability with other entities, because if there's another entity that also have a building of 3 floors, and because they are using 2 floors, then they will have a different measurement as the other one. So in terms of faithful representation, I think it's important to take into consideration the current asset as it is. We should not lose the focus on the asset, because I think the solution we are proposing here is a bit disproportionate to the problem we are trying to solve. Remember, let's keep in mind that we are trying to solve a fair value problem, that when there is no orderly market or where there is no highest and best use. So, but then when we are just giving as an alternative this current use, we are focusing on something else, and then we are harming also the public sector accountability. I think that if an entity has on its custody an asset, we should measure this asset according to its current state, not how the entity uses it, because that is the information that the users of the financial reports would like to see, what is really there, how we can asset the. So my proposal would be to replace current use per current state. So instead of focusing on the current use of the asset, because it's very subjective and can change from one entity to the other, I will focus more on what we can see. How is the asset? What is the condition of the asset at a specific moment? And based on that, we can measure it. So that will be my proposal. But if the other members think that, well, we should go forward with the current use, because I also recognize that we are in a very late stage of this process, then my second proposal will be as a plan B, to replace in the definition that we are proposing for current use, is to write like, okay, replace an asset at the measurement date based on its expected use over its useful life. I think it will make a bit clearer what we're trying to as the definition as it is. That will be my second proposal. But my preferred option will be don't to focus on current use, but rather on the current state of the asset. It will be much more objective. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Camila. I mean, I think you may be overthinking this, and I think we need to have a look at perhaps how we define various elements. I think certainly we cannot deal with comparability with other entities. This is an entity-specific thing that we're thinking about here. And whilst we're writing principle-based standards, so how they're applied in another context, providing our guidance is clear, we can't overthink that. So I think we have to disregard that. I'll take other comments, but I do think we need to break this down into a number of different issues, and we are going to come back. And it may be, I'll take a round of comments, it may be that we actually need to deal with those other issues, and then we'll come back to this. So I'll take Patricia, then Mike, then Todd, and then I'll go back to start.
Thank you. My comments about the current service value through the every issues and to contribute for a less costly and more faithful measurement, because I think it's very important for adoption and implementation. Specifically about the issue 1, I have other points, but specifically about the issue 1, I agree, but not with the consideration about the long term or our useful life, because current use is think in the context of the actual context, not during the useful life of the assets. For example, an entity shall consider the demographic changes and enrollment expected for a building where a school functions for a period of 30 years. I think it brings some complex estimation, because I need to think the use during the long-term period, because my suggestion is to use the same in the same way with IPSASB, that was foreseeable demand or foreseeable use. The period that the end is able to It's predicted use, not for long term or during the user for life. In some way is I think it's the same or that Camila present here. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. I'll both Dave and David have had discussions yesterday after the meeting with the valuers, and I might ask them to comment on that point about predicted, expected, because I think you're right that we need to try and not go somewhere different to the valuers if they already have a way of approaching an issue which would work for financial reporting too. So I'll go to Mike and then Todd, and then I'll go to either Dave or David for an update on the discussion with the valuers.
Thanks, Chair. So I suppose we've been talking about this for a while now, and I've been going through in my mind about use of, as Camilla has done, the term current use. And sometimes, if, for example, if there's a restriction attached to the asset, then current use might be an amount quite different to what it costs to replace the asset. And I just worried about use of current use in that context. And I was wondering also why we continue to use the word amount rather than cost. So my preference would be to replace amount with cost, because that's going to be what it's going to cost us to replace the asset. And maybe to stop the sentence at replace an asset full stop, rather than try and refer to current use.
Thanks, Mike. I'll ask for comments on that. I would urge us not to use cost at the moment because we've got other issues at play here. Todd, and then I'm going to staff.
Thanks, Ian. I think the point that I wanted to make is a little bit similar to Mike's, that I think fundamentally this measurement base is about what it's going to cost us to replace the asset, or the amount that it's going to take to replace the asset. I think that's what this is fundamentally about. And then it's in doing that where you might make some adjustments to getting to that point fundamentally. So I do see these sorts of issues that have been raised, like by Camilla with the use of the term current use. I can understand that that could get in the way of what I think fundamentally we're trying to do here, which is, you know, if we didn't have this asset, we need to know how much it would cost to replace the asset, essentially, under this measurement base.
Thanks, Todd. Lynn, and then at that point, I'm not taking any more interventions. I'll go to staff at that stage.
So it strikes me hearing the discussion that I'm not sure that all board members are on the same page in terms of what it is we are trying to measure here. I think some board members are, this is a, and I'll use old terminology, this is a replacement cost. This is a replacement for replacement cost, but we're not calling it replacement cost. I think other board members are on the, this is a, and I think Camilla, you said this is a measure of fair value and we haven't got an orderly market. I guess we need to sort of land, what is it we're trying to measure here, and are we trying to do too much? However, what does strike me is that the valuers, and we'll hear from staff in a moment, have techniques to measure, for want of a better description, a current value of an asset and its existing use. And that's either using a replacement cost technique or a income technique to get you a current value of an asset and its existing use. I think we're also confusing ourselves a bit about trying to do too much in the measurement. I get a bit nervous when we talk about our long-term use and the estimates in terms of how I'm going to use it over its estimated life. And we've still got bits in the text that talk about, you know, capacity and schools for 100 versus 500. And I think we're trying to sort of do too much. I think what we're trying to get to is a measure of an asset's value in its current use value the valuers have techniques that do that, both replacement cost and other techniques using income type approaches dependent on the characteristics of the asset. And so I just wonder if we are, because we're not all coming quite from the same place, we're not quite agreeing what it is we are trying to measure here. And I guess when I sat back and looked at this issue and, you know, the papers, there was part of me saying, well, is it replacement cost we're trying to measure? Should we call it that and be explicit about that? If it's not, and it's some sort of operational value, then I was quite relaxed about how we'd got to in the drafting. The drafting could always be improved, but if we're linking closely with the valuation techniques that will be used, which could be a cost or an income approach, I guess I was more relaxed. And I think some of the comments that are being made are because people are thinking we're measuring different things.
Thanks, Lynn. I think that's a helpful summary. Now I'm going to go to staff for an update on discussion with valuers, and then I think in terms of how we run the session, I think we need to deal with some of the other issues further on first, and then come back to this, because I think that will give us the clarity about what we're actually trying to do here, and also, as Lynn suggests, the approach that the valuers will take. So what I'm going to propose is that we hear from staff just in terms of relevant points coming out from that discussion yesterday. And then I think I'm going to take us to issue 4, and we will start talking about modern equivalent asset, because I think that's one of the key things that we need to actually bottom out. Dave or David, anything that you think at this stage would be useful before we get I think we go to issue 4 and we'll work our way through some of the more detailed issues, and then we'll come back and we'll look at the definition and the terminology in the context of having had those more detailed debates.
David, do you want to do a update, or do you want me to do it?
Well, I can give a brief update on what we talked about yesterday. I mean, the two issues we talked about yesterday with the valuers were how they use alternative sites, and secondly, what they do about excess capacity, which I don't think actually impinge on this particular discussion at all. I mean, in terms of this particular issue, I mean, 1 or 2 comments were made that might be useful, because what the valuer will, unless instructed otherwise, and I think the key thing to remember all the way through any of this is that the valuers act on instructions from the client. The public sector entity. A valuer has his or her own professional standards, and one of those professional standards requires them to challenge instructions if they think the instructions given by the client are inappropriate. So, for example, if you said, I don't like the fact that it's going to be a very high value. If I value an asset in this place, I want you to value it somewhere else where it's cheaper. They would challenge that because it might not be appropriate. So they will challenge, but on the whole, they operate using instructions from the client. And one of the things that they will need to be instructed about is the use of the property. What are you using it for? Do you intend to carry on using it in this way? Because it could influence their decision on the most appropriate valuation basis to use. So, I mean, in ordinary English parlance, or ordinary English, current use is something that they will use. Sometimes they call it current use, and sometimes they call it existing use. And the terms, and I think somewhere I was just trying to find it, but I know Dave has used that, the terminology and explanation in the draft ED to say what current use, existing use is. So that I think we need to be very careful. I mean, I can take Camira's point about, you know, we don't want to make things appear to be more complex than they are, but we also need to make sure that we can explain in the standard what it is that the accountant will need to understand when they're instructing the valuer. Because one of the issues that I've discussed with the valuers over many years, and not just this project, but I mean many years, is this bridge that is needed so that the valuer can understand the accountant, but also the accountant can understand the valuer. And that again did come out yesterday in our discussions. And another thing that did come out too, which I'll mention now because it's fairly generic, is the valuers were very keen to make sure that where necessary, the accountants require disclosure about what has been provided by the valuer in their reports, where the disclosures are appropriate for the understanding by the users of the financial statements of what the valuations actually mean. I think, Chair, that's probably enough for this topic, because the other issues we discussed would be more appropriate to discuss against other issues.
Okay, thanks, David. And I think probably the best way to really ground our understanding may well be actually that and I apologise for sort of dotting around, but I'm trying to work out what the best way is to help the board through this. I think looking at this, what I might suggest is that we actually have a look through the proposed implementation guidance at this stage, which was actually dealt with as issue 9. And that was in response to the point that Lynn made the other day, that we needed to, you know, link as closely into the valuation guidance as we could without actually impinging on you know, the valuation standards. And so that's why you know, the draft implementation guidance is there for the board. And I think it might be helpful actually just to walk us through that so that we're all clear what issues for financial reporting purposes we would need to instruct the valuers for, because I think then that will ground some of the discussion in the other you know, on the other issues, in that here's the information that they will need in order to exercise, to you know, undertake their professional duties. And it is making sure that we're interfacing then and we understand what we're asking for and can instruct appropriately, so that what they do under their standards will give us the information and we'll understand what that information actually is telling us. Okay, so is everybody happy with that? That we will now have a look at the supporting information for issue 9. And what we're doing here is then we're going to be walking through the material, which is on, I think,
page 85 of the
page 85. So if I can take us to that, and I think we just need to walk through that and make sure that we're happy and we understand that. And I think, you know, maybe we just literally go through that and make sure we're happy that we understand each of those sections in C. This is C1, I think. So I don't know, Dave or David, do you just want to walk us through the sections and make sure we haven't got any questions or concerns on that? I think it's reasonably self-explanatory, but just so that we understand what we're talking about.
So do you want me to take us kind of
literally
C1 section by?
Yeah, literally, I'm just saying let's walk through it. So if we go through C1, we've got, for example, A, the purpose of the valuation, what we're actually asking for the valuation for. and then just walk us through the rest of it, Dave, because I think then if we've all seen that, we're all grounded in that, then I think we can start to move off and say, okay, there are some specific issues that we're debating, but actually, you know, here's how the valuers would approach it.
So if we go to page 85, C1 talks about what type of information the valuers will require in the valuation. And then we have a few bullets below. The first, as Ian suggested, was the purpose of the valuation. The second was to identify the assets and liabilities being evaluated. We have a number of sub-bullets below that. The third point, C, this is on page 86, are assumptions or any special assumptions that the evaluators need to take into account. D is the valuation date. E is the reporting currency of the entity. F is limitations on the work of the valuation expert.
Can I just check? Yeah. So any questions, comments on that, Scott?
Yes, thank you, Ian. I just had a question over the source of this information. Is this relatively verbatim from the valuation, or is this our interpretation of what they told us? When I was reading it, I was trying to figure out from what perspective I should be reading it. So if you could help color that in, that would be helpful to my understanding.
Sure. Dave or David, back on that?
Well, I think I should also, first I will tell you that the IGs are currently with the valuation experts that we spoke to yesterday. They are reviewing it, but I did admit to them in the email that I sent that most of this is actually taken straight from international valuation standards. Right. I mean, the wording is slightly different because I might have amalgamated one or two things, but as far as I'm aware, I have not misinterpreted or even interpreted anything that they've said. So it is, if you like, what we wanted to try to do is give to the accountant, give a mirror image of what it would be, what the valuation experts would be expecting.
Thanks, David. Scott, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I had a follow-up question, because my question was, then should we acknowledge that in here some way? I think to help bridge this gap that we're talking about that's existing out there, if we could actually somehow put a preface into this that would explain it, I think it may help do exactly what you were talking about earlier about bridging this gap. That's why that's sort of why I asked that question.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. I mean, that actually is a thought that had gone through my mind. And if you or any other member have got a nice, elegant way that we can do it, I'd be very grateful.
Thanks, David. And I think that's a good suggestion, Scott. We probably need to make sure we've explained our thinking in basis for conclusions, and then the way in which we make that cross-reference. We do have precedents elsewhere, for example, reliance on work of experts, maybe in pension scheme values or whatever. So I think if we leave staff to go away and work out what the way within our literature would be, but I think you're right. The more we can make that bridge for people, the better. Lindy.
Thank you. So I guess it's similar to what Scott was asking. I guess just looking at this, we would have to look at it to make sure it aligns to our terminology, because I don't think we have real estate. It's very biased towards property, especially in the beginning. So then it's only if I'm valuing a building. So we would have to say, well, are we then being neutral, or is this only for property or buildings? And then I think we would also just have to check that it's consistent with what we're saying specifically on restrictions and, physical obsolescence and all of that. It's consistent with what we're saying in the measurement ED, because I don't want us now to say, well, this is what they do, we must align our standards to it. I think what we're trying to do is come up with a methodology, and then we need to make sure that everyone understands it and we can give the correct instructions. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. I think that's a reasonable instruction to give to staff. I mean, remember, this is implementation guidance, it's not authoritative. But as you say, absolutely, it needs to be the bridge. So it needs to be consistent with the guidance, the authoritative guidance that we have elsewhere, but also to build the bridge then between the two sets of literature. So I think that's a reasonable instruction. Todd.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I just wanted to say that I think it's going to be helpful to have a bit of a bridge between the accountants and the valuers, but I would just echo Lindy's comment that we need to make sure that we are clear exactly what we want from the valuers, and then make sure that what is put in this section C helps bridge what we want with the valuers.
Thanks, Todd. I mean, I think there is a balance, you know, and I think we need to make sure that we're not, you know, we identify any potential conflicts between what we might be looking at from a financial reporting perspective and what it says in valuation standards, because remember, we're dealing here with another professional group. So what we can't do is place them in a situation that we say we want X type of valuation and we want it done in this way, when the valuations, so it's about getting the right, you know, here's the broad thing we're asking for, which is covered in their standards. And I think that's what we have to do is understand each other, you know, and the reasons why. And I think that's what this is encouraging. But you know, we do need to be clear about what we're asking for and why, and that's really what this is saying. Okay, so I'll go back to David and then Mike and Lucy.
Thanks, Ian. Just to pick up on the use of the word "we" that Todd used. It's actually one of the things that did come out from our discussion with the valuers yesterday was that it will be jurisdictionally specific in many cases. So we need to make sure that what we write can be used by different jurisdictions in a way that actually meets their own circumstances and requirements, and legal requirements as well, because they did make the point that sometimes, you know, the legal framework in a jurisdiction will dictate some of what either the accountant or the valuer is allowed to do. So I mean, we need to be a bit careful on that front too.
Thanks, David. So go to Mike and then let's see.
Thanks, Jesse. In what you've just been saying, David, one of the things we do in my jurisdiction is to say to the valuer, all of the things that you've got in these words, but ultimately they've got to be able to show to us that this valuation they've come up with complies with IFRS 13. So we give them IFRS 13 or our equivalent and say that's what you've got to be able to satisfy. And if they can't, they don't take on the assignment. So that's where I think Todd's right. We've got to lead with this. So we say to them, here's our standard, and whatever you do has got to comply with our standard, whatever that ends up looking like.
Yeah, but Matt, back on that, Mike, IFRS 13 was actually completed with very detailed discussions with the valuation profession. So I don't think in that case, there's not actually an issue. That's already been done. It's if we try and override them in terms of, say, for example, they have a methodology on DRC. If we try and override their methodology, I think that's where the tension comes in. So I think there's a balance here. But, you know, this is about understanding and really understanding what we want and why, and whether that's, you know, how that would then be interpreted by the valuation profession. But on IFRS 13, there is no problem. That was done with IVSC. I'll go to Lucy and then...
Ian, sorry to interrupt you, and you're right. But remember, IFRS 13 was developed for the private sector, not for the public sector. So that's why we've had challenges in Australia. We've said to them, you've got to make sure it suits our needs. Sorry,
yeah,
I don't want
let's not go there. But I just want to say that, you know, there was very close working between the valuation profession on IFRS 13, and we know the issues. That's why we're doing the standard. But I just want to caution us that what we should be very clear, if we want something different, why we want that from what their valuation standards would give us. That's the point I'm trying to make. Lucy and then Lindy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I made some research on the different valuation methods that experts could use. And I found out that there are 5 main methods used when conducting a property evaluation, for instance. And these are comparison, profits, residual, contractors, and in that of investment. My question is, are the information that are enumerated in C1 be required in any of these types of methods to be used? Because if we're citing only the information that an expert needs for evaluation, but we don't mention about the evaluation method that would be employed. So there might be some information that are needed depending on the method that should be used by the experts. Thank you, Chair.
David, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. This particular, well, C1 and C2 are both important. They are generic. It's generic to any type of valuation methodology that the valuers would use. The valuers need this information before they can actually advise on the methodology, the valuation methodology that they think would be most appropriate based on all of this information.
Okay, so Lindy and then Patricia.
Thank you. Just another matter, I guess, and David, you said now it's the generic, but I do wonder if there are differences if you're using fair value or you're using what we use to have current service value. And I wonder if we need to identify that or have, maybe if we talk about modern equivalent asset, it's obvious that we're talking about a specific basis, but I do wonder if there should be nuances depending on whether you're using fair value or something else.
Can we hold your question, Lindy? Because I think we're still on just the generic information and we need to work through the other sections and also probably have the debate about various of the issues before we understand that. But I just want to work through the basic information so that we're all on the same page before we start getting into some of the more tricky issues. Patricia.
In relation between the accounts and valuation standards, I think it's important because if I know what the measure give me and how to measure, I can decide about the cost benefits and how situation that I can use. In fact, the account is not a value, it's not calculate and use the assumptions, but I think it's interesting to understand this. My analysis about the issues is based on the EVS2, try to identify the restriction about the measure, it consequently how it is useful in the financial report. And it's my point. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I think that really does underline why we're doing this and why we're trying to build this bridge so that there is that shared understanding. And you're right, it will go two ways. And that's very much the intention. Lynn.
So I think this discussion is really useful. I wonder if we are overcomplicating it still. And I'm not saying that this section is not useful, because I think this section in the implementation guidance is useful. But I wonder if it's back to actually, are we saying, or should we say, if we're holding purely for operational capacity and there is no income stream associated with the asset, depreciated replacement cost is the valuation technique, modern equivalent asset, everything that goes with that the valuers understand. If we're holding it for operational capacity, but it has got some form of financial capacity as well, there might be a different approach that is as suitable, an existing use value based on discounted flows. And if we're holding it for financial capacity, some form of fair value measurement highest and best use is appropriate. And we're not quite saying it explicitly as that, but if that's what we mean by the different the different measures that we're going to end up using, then coming right back to what do we mean by operational value? It's operational value or current service value for an asset purely held for operational capacity. Replacement cost. I'm not suggesting that we call it replacement cost.
Sorry to interrupt, but can we have that debate later? I just want to go through the basic valuation information, and then we'll walk through the issues, and then we'll come back up to these issues. I just don't want to get us into that debate just at this point in time. So if I can ask, can we just go through what the valuer wants from us in respect of any valuation or where there is specific information, and then we'll discuss those, and then we'll come back up. So I just want to walk through this logically, because I think we need to make sure we've all understood the issues involved. And back to the point about, do we have a shared view or do we not, and why do we not? I'd like to just come back up, and we will get to the sort of issue that you're talking about, but I just want to build up to that. And that's what I'm trying to lead us through. So if we can go back into this item and let's just walk through the basic information at this point in time, and then we'll identify where there are questions or concerns, okay? Matt. Ben, did you want to come in on that?
So one of the questions in there, though, is what capacity are we holding it for? I'll just point that out.
Okay, but I just want to tie down, narrow this down to what specifically are the issues that we're disagreeing with, because I think we need to understand there's a whole heap of stuff we just need to understand, and then we can come back up and answer those issues. So if we've got here's an issue that we know we need to debate, I'd just like to narrow it down to that, but on the basis we all share the same understanding of the information we're going to be giving, and where is it that we need to make a choice or give a view, okay? So David, can you take us, or Dave, can you take us back into this? And then let's just go through the rest of this, and then we can identify what specifically are the choices. And then I think that will take us to the issues that we need to discuss.
Sure, so I'll move on to C2, Ian,
Yeah.
which is at the bottom of page 86. And what C2 does is it expands on one of the items, the assumptions, which is C1 bullet point C. It talks about the assumptions that evaluator needs to know or needs to take into account. At the top of page 87, the first one is jurisdictional requirements. The second one on page 87, point B, is service delivery constraints. Point C is service delivery requirements. D is functionality. E is standard models.
Can we just pause for a moment, because I think the service delivery requirements is one of the areas of concern that members were expressing. And I think that some of the wording is useful in terms of, changes reasonably expected over the remaining life of the asset. So it's not ad infinitum, it's actually looking at the particular asset that we're talking about and saying, what can you reasonably foresee? And these are assumptions at a point in time. They're not saying under any circumstance or forever, which is why you're tying the valuation to a particular point in time. And in terms of disclosures and so on, that might well be one of the things that actually is important. Can I just check whether we have any questions on C2 then? Okay. So C3.
C3 is halfway, at the top of page 88, and this talks about what valuation basis do experts use. And I think this brings in David's point that you need to consider jurisdictional specificities when you're considering the valuation basis that the valuator will use.
Any questions on C3? Okay, so then we go into C4, which is where we hit the question about modern equivalent asset. So Dave, take us through that.
So C4 is the second half of page 88. The reason we added this was to provide a little more color on the modern equivalent asset guidance we have in the core text. And then we go into more detail on physical obsolescence, functional obsolescence, and economic obsolescence that, like I said, are in the core text.
Okay, so I think it's just important that we pause then on C4. And particularly it says a modern equivalent asset, this is in the second sentence, is one that provides similar function and equivalent utility to the asset being valued, but which is of a current design and constructed or made using current cost-effective materials and techniques. And I think that's the essence of it. Now, you know, you hit the sorts of issues lower down in terms of what that is actually about, but that's the core essence of what a modern equivalent asset is at a high level. Patricia.
Sorry, I'm very confused in relation to discussion because, for example, to evaluate in C4, I think it's necessary to discuss issue 4. I didn't understand the way that discuss are occurring. Sorry.
So what I wanted to do was actually, because we need to understand what the valuers actually understand by the terms. This is about the fact that, you know, if we're not careful, we're talking about one thing, the valuation profession is talking about something else. What I'm trying to do is get us to understand what the way the valuers would think about this. And then we can see whether what the valuers actually, the way the valuers think about this and address this would then influence our decisions on what we put in our standard. But we need to understand, there's no point in us having some totally different concept. What I'm trying to do is just ground our understanding in what the valuation profession would expect to do in a set of circumstances. So that's why I'm trying to walk us through this and make sure we understand what they're talking about. Then you're right, then we will go back to issue 4, but we will be better able to understand issue 4.
Okay, but in this case, it's important to discuss in this moment what is the modern equivalent asset is for valuation standard, for example.
Yeah.
Okay. I think, sorry, Lucy, when I organize my ideas and I come back. Yeah.
Okay, I go to Lucy and then back to Patricia.
No, I just want to request the staff to indicate the reference to give credence to the definition that we indicated there. The definition that you just cited, the modern in C4, was actually taken from, it's a definition actually of the International Valuation Standards Council. So that is how they define the modern equivalent asset, but I haven't seen any reference to that source. So I suggest we indicate that also in the paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I'll go back to staff. What we're trying to do is we can't directly reference somebody else's standard in our literature. So what we're doing is we're walking a fine line, which is actually drawing material in from those standards without actually saying it is paragraph XYZ of whatever. Now, we may be able to provide some background material outside our standards which will do this, but within our our standards or our IGs, we can't do that at this point in time. David, can I just ask you reassurance as to where this has come from so that Lucy has that reassurance? But in terms of what we publish in our standard, we will not be able to put that reference in.
Yeah, I mean, staff and the task force in all the years this project has been going on, modern equivalent asset we've always used with the meaning that the valuation community uses. It is a valuation community term, so it comes from the international valuation standards.
So Lucy, on your point, does that give you the reassurance that this is the valuation standards source? It's just we're not saying it's paragraph whatever from a particular standard.
Sir, Chair, can I?
Yep,
yes,
yep.
because it was quoted verbatim from the definition of a definition by the standard International Standards Council. So that's why, and then there was no reference from where it was taken. So I understand that we can get ideas from the definitions of IPSASB, and it will not be in that. It should not be quoted verbatim in our standard, but in this case, it was quoted verbatim. So that's why I thought there is a need for us to give the source, to state the source where the definition was taken from. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. I mean, we will look at what we also put out by way of guidance, and it may well be that we can have a staff Q&A or something like that that actually does contain that sort of material so that everybody's clear about it. It's just we can't have it in our authoritative literature and standards. And we can look at whether we put something like that out with the ED so that people understand that, at least on a temporary basis. So I've got Todd and then go back to Patricia.
Thanks, Ian. I think I'm getting a little bit lost in this conversation and just want to clarify a few things. So this material that's been put in section C is largely drawn from valuation material, and we're currently working through to get an understanding of the way that the valuation community sees things. I still think at some point we're going to have to come back and actually look at, if we're going to be publishing this section C, what we want to have in there, and it will need to be based on where we get to in terms of, as accountants, what we want to see out of evaluation for this particular measurement basis, whether it be operational value or whatever we call it, and then we'll need to make sure that we are clear what we want out of that, and then provide that bridge. So the way that I'm seeing it, the wording that's in C, all of that may not stay exactly as it is now, because as we work through what we want out of this valuation basis, we may need to come up with some different wording in there to help accountants when they're engaging with the valuation community to be able to talk in the same language, if you like. Is that right?
I think at the moment, can we just go through and say, except that what we've got here is what comes out of the valuation literature. If at some stage we need to go back and add some clarification and explanation, which doesn't conflict with what's in valuation, then I think that's fine. I think it's the question we will face is if we have a conflict, and I think we just need to cross that bridge as and when. So at the moment, this is a draft. We need to get the valuers to make sure they're happy with it. And if there's a conflict with what we want coming out of our debates, then we need to resolve that as and when that arises. That's okay. So can I go back to Patricia, please?
Okay, thank you. Specifically about the modern equivalent assets, I think the valuation standards helps to understand how we what requirements about modern equivalent assets we decide to include in the measure. I think the text in the EVS there are two sections that modern equivalent assets is presented: the plant and equipment and real property interest. But in both, the modern equivalence assets is used when is an assumption of the replacement cost that are one of the methods used for estimating the value of asset, particularly specialized based on the cost approach. Then I think it's very restriction to use modern equivalent assets. There are two other methods: reproduction cost and summation methods. I think in this case, reproduction cost appears in the proposed in the appendix B. And there are different in replacement cost and reproduction cost, because replacement cost a method that indicates value by calculating the cost of a similar asset offering equivalent utility, and reproduction cost a method on the cost that indicates value by calculating the cost to recreating a replica of an asset. I think what is important now about this, because I can include the modern equivalent as in a way that the cost benefit of information is warrant. And then for me, it's important, and in my analysis, it was very important to think about what kind of assets I need to use the assumption modern equivalent assets. It is directed for specialized assets, not all the assets. For example, the asset, the example about the land, it's not a good example for using the modern equivalent assets, because it's more probably I can use the market approach. I think it's a in this case, but consequently, I suggest to change the C4, and I can send the main points that I take. I think it's I think it's the main about the modern equivalent assets.
Okay, thanks, Patricia. That's helpful. David, I mean, obviously there are some nuances here. Anything you want to say back on that at this point in time? So, Patricia, just to go back on what you said, you're not saying what is here is wrong, but you're just questioning whether there may be some additional material that we want on the other bases like reproduction and so on at some stage.
Is that what she meant?
Yeah, I think so.
Right. Well, I mean, if the board wants material on that, then we can put it in. I mean, the reason we put in modern equivalent asset is, well, I think twofold. One is that the board, several board members questioned what it actually is. And of course, it is something that the valuers use. And also, given that the valuers will use the modern equivalent asset approach mainly for specialized property assets, real property, so buildings, and it's usually used in the public sector context. It is very public sector specific. So those are the reasons why we put those in. I mean, the other methods, well, certainly reproduction is very rarely used from what I can understand. So I don't know. I mean, if board members want an IG on it, then we could put something in.
Okay, can we hold that one as a possibility? Because I think, you know, I could imagine a situation where, you know, there might be a requirement to put a facsimile of a listed building back, and you might use a sort of reproduction cost. But as you say, it probably is quite rare. So can we hold that one as to whether we include it or not, or we might reference?
I'd also say that, I mean, on something like that, it's going to be very jurisdictional specific, probably, and related to sometimes related to legislation. Certainly, for example, in the UK, it would be, they might say, well, if you want to reproduce what do they use the word, iconic, I think, an iconic building, they probably would not replace the whole building, but what they do is they put a modern equivalent asset, but they would front it with something that was almost like a reproduction perhaps of the facade of the building, and that's the only thing. So that would not be reproduction cost, it would be a modern equivalent asset with some specific instructions from the client to put that front on it. I mean, there are so many different ramifications of what you can instruct the client, or the client can instruct the valuer to value, that it would be very difficult to put in every specific circumstance, and I don't think that's the intention of the IG.
Okay, well, look, let's not get into detail on this. I just want to go through, and I just want at this stage not to have the debate about when we would use these. I just want to go through and clear this material, and then we will go back and then we will look at issue 4, okay? So Patricia, unless you have a problem with what's here, can we then have the discussion on issue 4 separately when we've got through this IG? Because I just want us all on the same page, literally, and are we happy with this IG? Then we will go back. Mike.
So Chair, I think I can see what you're trying to do. So I'm happy that this material should be included. I agree with Todd. There needs to be some way to reconcile this to the terms that accountants would use. So for example, in this text, I can't see a reference to service potential. I can't see a reference to financial or operational capacity. So maybe we just need some way to reconcile it. And the other thing is that I suppose I'm just worried about your reluctance to give credit directly to the IPSASB community, because in Australia, we make direct reference in our standards to the GFS manual, for example, in material that's non-authoritative. So can we not do that in non-authoritative material?
Well, look, can we just deal with that issue later? Because I really don't think that that is, you know, a huge issue at the moment. Exactly, I will ask staff to provide some advice on, we can make a general reference. What I'm saying is I don't think it's appropriate to make specific references because those references can change, okay? Now, in terms of precisely how we use it, precisely what the wording is, we're trying to work our way through the draft at this point in time to help understanding. Now, if it means later, as a result of a later debate, that we have to come back and amend something here, fine, but I just want us on the same page before we then have the conceptual debate, because I'm worried that we're going to have the conceptual debate without actually asking what the practical issue actually is and the way that the valuers would deal with it. And that's what I just want to get us through. So can we please go back to just clearing through this material and make sure we have the shared understanding of what the valuers will do, and then we'll go back and have our debate, and then we can work backwards and forwards. But I'm worried that we haven't had this before, and we need that understanding. So that's what I'm trying to do on this. Then we can have the debate, because we will then understand what we would be talking to other professionals about. Okay, sorry, but I'm just really trying to just stop us having debates before we've got the basics right, and that's what we need to do. Dave, can you take us through the rest of this material, and then we'll go back into issue 4.
So the next point is on page 89, C5. Do I have to use a valuation expert external to my entity? And the response is, if you've got experts internal to your entity, those are appropriate to use.
Okay, can I check whether anybody has any problems with that? Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. It's a small point, but I've just never seen the reference in the last part of this where you're going to basically give the qualifications for the expert in the footnotes. We may have that some places. I tried to flip through some other standards and find it, but I'm not aware where we give this much specificity about where we got the value expert. It just seemed way over the top. As a matter of fact, I know some valuation experts, the reports are restricted to management of the organization, and I could see this being a problem. So it's more of a question is, can we really do this? I didn't know we could do this, so.
Dave or David on that?
Well, I've seen it. I mean, it does happen in the UK, for example, that you would be required to put that in. It's an indication to the users of the financial statements that the valuations were carried out by someone who got the relevant qualifications to do the job. And it's a mirror also of the requirement in the valuation profession to give all of those details in the valuer's report so that the client is aware that the valuation was carried out by a professional.
I've just not seen it from the US perspective. You're absolutely right. It is the responsibility of management to make that decision. It just seems like if you have multiple value experts in this thing, this would get very cumbersome in a set of disclosures. That would be my point.
Okay, thanks, Scott. So I think we can take that one away and look at that. So, I mean, in terms of Lindy.
Thank you. And I don't have the exact reference, but I do think we do talk about the use of valuers in our asset standards. So we just have to check the consistency. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindy. And I should just underline that this is all going to be subject to the editorial process. So points about consistency and so on will get looked at through that. And if there are any significant points that come back that, you know, come out through the editorial process, those will be put on the agenda for discussion in the February meeting. So you're right about consistency. So what I'm taking from this is that we're content that we have this implementation guidance in the attached to ED77. There is some need to resolve this issue about how precisely do we tie it into the valuation literature, what credit do we give, etc. And I think we ask staff to come back on that, not necessarily for Tuesday, but for when we finalise this as exactly how they want to finesse that. There may be a need to make amendments either because of what we decide elsewhere or because we feel that there's a need for some sort of additional interpretation so that accountants can instruct appropriately, and we can add that. So with that, are there any other points that anybody wants to make on this particular IG? David?
Thank you, Ian. If I could just pick up on your last point about things that we might need, or the members think that an accountant might need to instruct on. If you could look at that in the context of C2, whereas sort of under the assumptions, special assumptions, that mainly deals with, you know, the special instructions that the entity or the accountants might need to give to the valuer. So it could probably fit in there, or I could split it out. But have a look at that IG to see what's there and what else you might want.
Thanks, David. So I think having gone through that, my proposal would be that we go back and have a look at issue 4. I think that's the logical place to go next.
So do you want me to kick off? There's 3 bullets here. You want me to take them one by one? So issue 4 is modern equivalent asset. There were 3 aspects that the IPSASB asked us to consider. The first one was whether land should be valued based on its current site or whether an alternative site should be used. Going back to what staff uses the purpose of this measurement basis, how much it would cost to replace the asset in its current use. We thought it'd be more appropriate, and this is consistent with the valuation community, to use an alternative site. What staff does propose is when an alternative site is used, a disclosure be made for the fair value of the current site so that it's completely visible to users that there is a difference between an alternative site and the current site that's being used.
Thanks, Dave. And that proposal is then to, from a public financial management perspective, to be clear that there is a difference, that there is a value that's being tied up in having that site in its current place that is potentially accessible because you could have the asset elsewhere. Yeah. Okay. So I'll go to David and then to Patricia.
Thank you, Ian. I just wanted to mention that this is one of the issues that we did discuss yesterday with the valuers, and they made the point that they would only consider an alternative site for a modern equivalent asset. It's not for any other type of valuation methodology that they would use. It's only in relation to a modern equivalent asset. And it would only be considered if that was agreed as the approach to take with the client. So going back to what we were talking about, the instructions, if you were looking at a modern equivalent asset methodology, the client could instruct the valuer to value a modern equivalent asset on the existing site if that was what was required for operational reasons. The reason that they would think about an alternative site is if that alternative site was more appropriate for the modern equivalent asset. So there are lots of ifs and buts there. But I think that the real point is that if the client instructed that an alternative site should not be used, then the valuers would not use an alternative site.
Thanks, David. That's helpful clarification. So I've got Patricia and then Todd on.
I would like to clarify one question before to present my opinion about this point. When they mention about the operational capacities, those operational capacities refer to both cash generating and non-cash generate activities or assets.
Can I don't know if Dave or David, you're ready to answer on that one, or shall I just take the comments from Todd and Kimira first?
So I can quickly come in if I understood the question correctly. If you're holding an asset for operational capacity, you could earn cash flows from it. It's just not the primary use of the asset.
Sorry, could you repeat, please?
So if you are holding an asset for its operational capacity, so you're holding it to deliver a service, it is still possible to generate cash flows from that asset. It's just not the primary objective for holding the asset.
But if it was the primary objective, it's not included in the application of the measure, because in some cases the public entity has assets that are used with primary objective to produce cash. It's correct. It is okay. Okay.
So I would agree with that, Patricia. If the asset is held for its financial capacity, the general thinking is we would measure it at fair value if you were applying a current value measurement basis.
Okay, this interpretation, I think it's not clear in the paper, in the material. I think its interpretation is very important to understand what I want with the value, the measuring base, and its implication in EG 78, because some assets is used with primary objective to generate cash.
Yeah.
I think 2 points, but
Yeah,
but sorry.
Tricia, sorry to interrupt you on that. I think staff will present some material which I think will address your point, both the one you've made now and also the one you made the other day in terms of that, which basis do I use? But you're right. You were right when you made that point the other day that it should be some additional application guidance to ED 78, and they will present some proposals on that to address your point on that.
Okay, but my point is not this one, because I needed to clarify the point to think about my analysis in relation to point A. I think that the discussion is a specific point of the general point. I think here the point is connected with issue 6 about the restriction, or about what what the entity must consider when apply the modern equivalence assets. For example, in the literature, evaluation literature, is present some conditions, or I think not conditions, but some points, some restrictions that entity need to consider when apply the assumption. I think it's not clear in the evaluation literature, but I think it can reflect what we can about the measure. I think, for example, that you can have a more generic requirement, like, for example, the modern equivalent asset must be physically possible, financially feasible, legally permissible, and according to public policy requirements. Then I define, it's not a range of alternatives to think about the assets, but considering the context of the assets in the public sector, because it's an entity specific. Because this, I think it's not land is a specific, is a case of application, but not the generic rules. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. I think that was, listening to what you were saying, that was my feeling, was that it wasn't that the general principle was understood, but it was that specific application and the context. So I think that's an instruction to staff to work with you just to provide that bit of elaboration in terms of application guidance. Okay, so Todd next, and then Kamira, and then Lindy.
Thanks, Ian. When it comes to modern equivalent assets, I think there are some of those principles that the valuers use that I would agree are important to pick up from a financial reporting perspective. But the one around land and valuing an alternative site is one that I disagree with for financial reporting purposes. I think we want to value the piece of land that is there, as opposed to some alternative site from a financial reporting perspective. And I think that has the right information value for our users. So I think from a user perspective, that is the best number to reflect on the balance sheet, the value of the land that is actually there, not the value of land that's somewhere else.
Thanks, Todd. So So can I just explore that point a little bit more, because I think it is really important. So I think what we're saying is, unless there is a clear reason why the property needs to be in that specific location, there may be value tied up in the site because of where you have it. So the question then is, do you put the alternative use in the balance sheet with disclosure about the difference between that and the value in the current location, i.e. what's tied up there that could be realised, or do you put that higher value? And I think what I was hearing you say is you want the higher value in the balance sheet, but would you oppose having a disclosure on that difference, whichever value you put in? Can I just ask you back on that?
No, I wouldn't have a problem with having disclosure around differences, but I think the number that's the most relevant for the balance sheet is for the piece of land that you actually own.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I'll take the other comments, and then I want to go back to Dave and David on this. I think Camira is probably in the same place as you on that. Camira?
Yes, thanks, Chair. I just have two minor comments in this issue paper and issue 4. It's related also to what Todd mentioned in that example that we are mentioning of the size of the land, and then we in that case it also contradicts a bit what we already saw now in the implementation guidance in C4, when what the evaluators will do, that is they will take they say that the cost should reflect the condition, functionality, and the characteristics of the assets. So for that, in that case, we should value the actual size of the land and not the size of the tree as a smaller land, because that is not that will not reflect the reality. What you can verify that you have a land with this size, why should you take another size based on use? So the use should not override the actual characteristics of the assets. And the second observation was there is a small recommendation of the staff in that same page where they say, like, okay, if there's a difference or something, the staff recommend a disclosure requiring the fair value of the existing site. But in that case, if you already have the fair value of the existing site, you will not be using this operational value. So then that disclosure doesn't make sense anymore, because if you already have the fair value, you will not be using this operational value. That is my assumption. So thanks.
Thanks, Camira. Lynn, and then I'll go back to Dave and David.
So this is one where the valuation community are clear in their methodology about how they value a modern equivalent asset, and they have rules in which that they do this, and those rules would base a modern equivalent asset on the alternative site with the alternative size land, i.e. not the land we currently own. So if we're going to go with Todd's suggestion, we would have to clear how that works with the valuation community, and what exactly are we asking them to do? Are we asking them for a modern equivalent asset with the constraints of my existing land, because the place where my current land mass is might be the most efficient for building purposes, so it could have a knock-on impact in terms of how they value the modern equivalent asset of the building, depending on where we land on this. And I think we need to be really clear. We either have the option of accepting that the valuation community have a modern equivalent asset way of valuing that puts land on an alternative site in certain instances where it's available to be built on an alternative site. If we accept that, then I think we end up in this disclosure territory, which is what's being put forward. I think if that's where we end up, we ought to look carefully at what we think the right disclosure is, which is Camira's point. I think we should only, first of all, have a disclosure of potentially the difference, and only where it's material, because it might not be material in many instances. So I think we ought to think hard about that disclosure. Otherwise, we need to think about, if we're not going to do that and we're going to insist on the valuation, the instructions to the valuers to be, you've got to value the land I own, we then need to think about the consequence of that. Are we saying you've got to then value a building built on the land I own, or are we happy to base the assumptions on the building to be on the alternative site more efficient piece? So there's a consequence to either of those.
Thanks, Lynn. So I'll take Todd then, Lindy. At that stage, I want to go back to staff, but I think you've articulated the issue very clearly. Thanks, Lynn. Todd, then.
Yeah, just coming back on that, if I understood what David was saying earlier correctly, this is a matter that you would want to be briefing a valuer on, whether there would be an alternative site. So if our standard says in briefing a valuer, it's at the site that you have, then that's not conflicting with the valuation standards. It's just that we would have our financial reporting standard in this area saying that we want you to value the asset that we have. So the land that we have, and then putting the modern equivalent asset on it, or in some cases under it, if it's pipes or whatever. So that's where I'm at on this. I think it is the piece of land that you own. And if we can instruct the valuers in that way, and it's not conflicting with their valuation standards to do that, if we have that in our financial reporting standard, if I understand what David was saying correctly.
Thanks, Todd. I'll take Lindy, and then I want to go back to for clarification to staff on that particular point. Lynn, can you wait until after I've gone back to staff for clarification, because I think that would help us just before we take the debate forward?
I can clarify if that helps.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay, go ahead and just do that, and then I'm going to go to Lindy.
So I guess that is an instruction you could give to the valuers, Todd, but the danger in that instruction is that you lose what might arguably be equally useful information, that actually if a modern equivalent asset was an alternative site, then you ought to be driving some information. You could arguably be driving some useful information by challenging that and disclosing that, but you are right, we could make a decision at this board that instructs the valuers in the way that you have said, but there is an opportunity cost, I guess, in that we are losing useful information where actually the public sector has chosen to put something in an inefficient place and it doesn't need to be there, and there could be a more efficient place to put it.
Thanks, Lynn. So I go to Lindy, and then I will go back to Dave and David.
Thank you. And I think just part of your clarification, if you can just also clarify this for me. So the IG is the generic that the valuation community uses, and it's generic because it's aligned to, and it's even said there, it's aligned to the cost approach under fair value. So the cost approach under fair value has this notion. We also using it for measuring operational capacity, but we are amending that when we are measuring assets held for its operational capacity, or are we amending the guidance throughout? Because I don't think that's what we're doing. We're just looking at assets that are being held for financial capacity, and the consequences of that is that your valuation would be different. Because I just want us to make sure we understand that there is a generic approach. We're still keeping that in when you're under fair value. We're amending that when we're under the other measurement basis, and this is why, and it's because of the objective of that measurement basis. Now, whether we want additional disclosure because of that, I don't know, because we've designed it to measure exactly what the use is. So I also struggled with the whole inclusion of fair value, because I don't know how you would calculate that then as a disclosure, but that was just making sure I understand everything. Thank you. Okay.
So Dave and David, can you give us some clarification on this point, that as to whether we essentially have a choice as from a financial reporting perspective as to which value goes in?
Okay, well, I think the first point I would make is that the valuation community, when they talk about assets, they don't mean land. If they mean land, they say land. So when they're talking about the asset, they're talking about the property on the land. Okay, so I hope that clears up one or two slight misconceptions. I mean, I think Lynn's right. I mean, if you do instruct that a modern equivalent asset has to be built on this particular site, i.e. the valuation, there will be knock-on consequences, because the reason that the valuers would look to an alternative site, they would take into account the need perhaps for the locality or something like that. But what they're looking for is the most efficient way to deliver the services from a modern equivalent asset built on an appropriate piece of land. So that means that in general terms, the costs associated with the modern equivalent asset, either gross replacement costs, are likely to be lower than if you constrained the valuers to erect a modern equivalent asset on your current piece of land, which might not be appropriate. So you've got all sorts of consequentials in that direction. Equally, of course, as Todd points out, you've got consequentials from doing it the other way. So I think it's more a question of what do you want and how do you well, I suppose, how do you present this information to the users of your financial statements? And I don't mind really which way the board goes, because we can actually, write the IG or whatever in whichever way the board wants, so long as the valuation community is content with the way that we want it is something that they can deliver, because if they can't deliver it, you won't get a value, full stop. I mean, personally, I would say that you let the valuers do their professional bit of work, and then you make the appropriate disclosures. So, for example, if you were building as a modern equivalent asset a hospital that was, say, a specialist hospital that dealt with an entire region, and at the moment it was situated in a very expensive area of the capital or the main towns of that region, but you could put it somewhere else. You could actually have a much more efficient operation on a cheaper piece of land. It probably is well to have that valuation, which is what you use, and then disclose in the accounts what the valuers would then give you would be the value that you could achieve from releasing that site. So you could actually demonstrate to the user that you could release the money. But equally, I can see you could do it the other way around and say, well, if I put this modern equivalent asset here and keep it here, then it's more expensive to deliver the operation. So, I mean, which way does the board want to go? I mean, we can do either.
Thanks, David. I think that's helpful clarification. So it basically is, do you want that higher value or the optimized lower value in your financial statements, i.e. in your balance sheet? Clearly, from a public financial management perspective, we should have the disclosure of the difference in value if it's material, whatever. So whichever route we go, then we can require that disclosure. So I think that's common, and basically the straightforward decision here is, do we want the higher value, the current site in our balance sheet, or the lower site value? That's the choice. What I want to do is just take comments on simply that choice, and then I'm actually just going to ask for a show of hands from board members as to which way you want to go. and we will go with the majority in terms of what goes in the proposal, but we will set this out in basis for conclusions, and we will have a specific matter for comments on this. So I literally just want to take, and I don't want long comments, I just want a short, I favour this or this type intervention, and then I want to take a vote on it. Okay, so I'll go Mike, Patricia, Scott, Todd, and then Lynn, and then we're going to vote.
Thank you, Chair. I prefer the higher value. That's the likelihood is that we're not going to move that building, so it's going to be there for a long time. That's my experience. So therefore, we're going to use the higher value, and it also improves the representation of the depreciation charge on the P&L account. So it's not just about the balance sheet.
Thanks, Mike. That's clear. Patricia?
Yes, my question is the discussion about land. Land is a unit of account. And when I think about the land, I think the possibility that what's the possibility the entity has, because, for example, I can think about the other side, but it's and not have condition to disinvest and invest in other property. I think it's not. It's not. I think it's land. It's not a good example to apply more than equivalent assets, because it's a unit of account and involve other decisions about the think other sides.
Okay, I mean, I think the point though in this debate is where the material difference is going to come is in respect of land. It's not in respect, you know, it's unlikely to be in respect of the actual structure you put on it. It's likely to be the land. So, I mean, you know, notwithstanding what you said, I think the question is still, do we want the value of the land where it is currently or the alternative? And that's really what I want to just get the board to make a decision on at this point in time. So I'm going to go to Scott, Todd, then Lynn, then Camira, and then we go.
Thank you, Ian. I raised my hand because of a comment that David made, and that is we ought to let the valuation people do their job. And my experience is that most governments are clueless about this conversation. And I think the more complexity we put on them, the more difficult this is going to be. And so, David, I raised my hand because you struck a chord when you said that, and that is we ought to let the valuation specialists do their job, just like the pricing people do their job on the investment side. And I don't think we ought to be wandering into the camp, but I think we do need to have disclosures about whatever decision they make. The other point is we're talking like every building here is material. You know, there's hundreds or thousands of these items that are out here, and I can't imagine one building being in that material when we're arguing about these particular items. So I would suggest we let valuation people do their job and we let the disclosures inform the community.
Thanks, Scott. So I go to Todd, Lynn, and Camira.
I'll keep it short. I agree with what Mike said. I think it's the higher value for the reasons that Mike outlined.
Thanks, Todd. Lynn, and then Camira.
So I happen to agree with Mike as well. I'm glad we've had this discussion because I've had it in practice where it's been the lower value and I've not, in my audit capacity, felt that that was appropriate or the right stewardship. So I do agree with Mike. I've got two other points to make. I think the valuation community can be instructed to value a model equivalent asset built on this site. I don't think that is in any way difficult for them to do, and I think that's an easy instruction. I do agree about the materiality, but I think there's a cumulative effect because what I've seen in practice is every building being valued on an alternative site, and you end up with a very different valuation in your balance sheet. So I think the materiality is there because I think you have a cumulative effect. My final point is about the disclosure. I think there should be a narrative disclosure of what you've done and why. I don't think you should have a fair value disclosure of the alternative site because actually that means you end up having to get two valuations done. for one asset, and I don't think that that is right. If we go with the option of modern equivalent asset based on the site that you own, I think you can do that in a narrative explanation, not a second value.
Thanks, Lynn. I think we would have to have a discussion about that separately, because I think the valuation profession would probably say that if they've been instructed, it's something that is actually a relatively minimal additional cost, getting a land valuation. Once you've done the rest of it, actually you can provide, their indices and all of that kind of thing. So I'm not, I think we can put a question in on that. So, because I think there are a lot of people would say the financial management information, i.e., you could actually release £1 million or whatever by selling that site, actually is useful information, and it's an incentive for management if they have to put that number in to actually do something about it. So I'm going to go to Camira, and then I know other members want to come in, but I'm actually going to take a vote at that stage, because I think we've spent long enough on this and we need to discuss some of the other issues, and we're just going to go one way or the other. So as I said, I'll take Camira and then we're going to vote.
Thanks. I also support Mike's and Todd's and Lynn's comments. I go for the higher, sorry, I support to present the higher value, because it's more objective. It's based on the current state of what they have, and also public sector institutions should be accountable for the use of that asset. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. So let's be clear on this. The proposal is either that you value the current, essentially the current piece of land, and then you disclose the difference that could be released with a different site, or you put the lower value in and you disclose the difference with the higher value. So that's essentially, that's the choice. We will explain it. We will specifically ask, specific matters for comment on this. So explaining basis of conclusions and an SMC. So can I take a show of hands on who would value the current site in the, and put that in the balance sheet, i.e. option 1.
Can I ask everyone to also use the hand raise function just to make sure we capture it, and then I'll get them taken down? So please use the hand raise function if you're voting for first option.
Ross, please repeat the option. Could you repeat the option?
So the option is, option 1 is put the current site, the higher value, in your balance sheet and disclose the difference with the lower site value elsewhere. Option 2 is the lower site value elsewhere with the difference between the higher option disclosed.
Thank you.
At the moment for option 1, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hands raised.
Okay, and those who favour the lower value?
So can I get the hands taken down? And now please raise your hand if you're voting for option 2, the lower value. So I had 8 hands raised for option 1, the higher value. I'm seeing 3 hands raised for option 2, the lower value. So option 1, higher value, disclosure of the alternative site.
Okay, thanks. I think that's helpful. So we will explain that in the basis for conclusions. We will ask an SMC. I think we also ask staff to consult colleagues from the valuation profession on how that would be, whether we need to put additional text in, for example, in the IG guidance, just to make that clear, how that would be, so that people can implement that in practice. Okay, so with that, I think we come to a break. When we come back, I will ask Dave and David just to report back on where we're going on issue 5, and then we will go to issue 6 at that point in time. So if we can be back at 5.2, please.
1 minute.
Thank you, David. Welcome back. Now I'm going to go to you for a report back on the discussion yesterday. But Patricia, you have your hand up.
Yes, I think we're not discuss the point. I did not discuss the point B and C of the issue 4.
Yeah, I think, I mean, in terms of issue B, it seems to me issue B falls away given the decision that we've just made, because we're talking about the current site. And
I think it's, in my view, it's more, again, it's the discussion about modern equivalent assets more generic than only related to land. Because these, I think...
Can we just look, I think we need to, you know, we're right down in the weeds here. We've got plenty of other issues that we need to deal with. I think I would like to come back to this at a later stage, please. So I'm going to move us on to issue 5 now. We really need to deal with these other issues today. We can come back at a later stage on those 2 specific issues. But I'm going to move us on to issue 5. So David and Dave, please, can you report back at this stage?
Okay, well, you've noticed that you haven't got anything yet on excess capacity. Well, that's because Dave and I are still considering the implications of yesterday's discussion with the valuers, because it, as Dave put it to me, it seemed to take them by surprise that anybody's got any issue about excess capacity. I mean, we discussed it mainly in the context of the example that Todd was used a couple of times in discussion, and that is if I've got a building and I'm only using 80% of it and I'm not using the other 20%, what do I do? And the valuers seem, and I'm going to use that word seem at the moment, because as I say, Dave and I need to finish discussing this afternoon. They seem to suggest, well, you would just value the 100% of the building anyway, which actually makes entirely logical sense, because, I mean, the discussion was, well, they would, if you had got 20% under occupied, the valuers would want to know why. So that would actually be one of the things that you would actually have to tell the valuers as to why. And what were your plans for it? Now it might be as one of the, because there were 3 valuers on the call, one from New York, one from the UK, and one from Canada somewhere. I'm not quite sure where. Ontario province, I think, but I'm not sure. And their view was, well, there may be very good reasons why you can't use that 20%. And it might be that you're the sort of operation that has to take security considerations into account, and so you can't let anybody else use other floors or whatever in your building. So if you can't use it, it stays mothballed. And there may be, they also used an example of a works yard. You know, so there you've probably got all sorts of little buildings all dotted about all over the place, and you might have some of them under occupied for some of the time. or all of the time. But again, for logistical reasons, you would never be able to use it, or no one else would ever be able to use it. So to all intents and purposes, the surplus or excess capacity is irrelevant. It's still your site. So anyway, Dave and I are going to be working on how we can incorporate some of that. My view is it might well be that it's something that we put in the IGs as part of the instructions, that this is the sort of information you might need to pass to the valuer. But we hope to come back to you, or we intend to come back to you tomorrow with more on issue 5.
Thanks, David. That sounds helpful. And I saw when you were explaining the sort of general principle, thumbs up from members. So I think it's that sense of there's a rebuttable presumption here, but the presumption is value on the basis of full use. So anyway, you'll come back to us on that. Okay. Lynn, I don't want to get into debating this at this stage. Can you come back on when we've got the paper or when we've got the slides from staff? Can I move us on then to issue 6, please? So Dave and David introduce that.
So issue 6 deals with restrictions and social policy objectives. The first portion on restrictions, we focused on legal restrictions. The board asked us to focus on legal restrictions, obviously, and that's why we did it. And we included guidance that was consistent with what's in IVS that talks about how legal restrictions should be taken into account in evaluation. So if a land is zoned in a certain way, that's a legal restriction. It should be taken into account in the valuation. The second portion of the paper relates to social policy objectives. So this is if you've decided to use a building as a hospital, it should be valued as a hospital. And that ties back to, I guess, a discussion we'll come back to later on current use of the asset.
Thanks, Dave. So open up for comments on that. Anybody disagree with what staff are proposing on this? Mike.
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to clarify if I understand it right, and bearing in mind the discussion we've just had about do you want the higher value on the balance sheet or the lower value. If there's a restriction, as long as that restriction doesn't result, Dave, in we end up with a lower value, because I still think we need to end up valuing the replacement cost of the asset. So therefore, it's the higher value that I'd be interested in, just despite the restriction. Land may be a different issue, but at least as far as the infrastructure, the building is concerned, I think I wouldn't want to see the restriction result in a lower value.
Sorry, Mike, just pushing back on that. If it's a legal restriction, are you saying you would want to disregard the legal restriction?
So let's take an example. If the zoning says it's zoned for a hospital, then it's a hospital, and we value the hospital according to the replacement cost of that hospital. If the zoning changes and we now can replace that with something else, then that may change the valuation that the valuer or the management may want to use. But whilst the zoning is in place or the restriction is in place, and if the government's going to continue to run that part of the town as a hospital, then that's the way it should be valued.
Okay, thanks, Mike. That's clear. So Todd, then.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think my comment's similar to Mike's. When it comes to restrictions, I don't know how much it's likely to affect the value of some of the things that we will be valuing under operational value or whatever term we end up landing on, because in my mind, it's about replacing that asset. And so, if you've got, as Mike said, a piece of land that's restricted for a hospital, well, you need to be able to replace the hospital on that land. So that land's going to have probably the same value as land surrounding it, regardless of the fact that it might be restricted for the hospital.
Thanks, Todd. So Camilla.
Thanks. Yes, I also support Todd's and Mike's view. I'm only just disagree with the word current use. It's more the current state of the asset in my personal view. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a different issue that you're getting into there, Camira. And that's actually getting us, I think that's more an impairment question compared to the actual valuation question. I'll go back for clarification on that with staff, but I think that's actually an impairment issue you're referring to there. Adrienne.
So I'm possibly confused about what we're valuing here, whether we're valuing the hospital or the land, because to me as an economist, any restriction is going to reduce the value. And so I'm worried about what I think Mike and Todd are saying, which is to ignore the economic impact of restricting the use.
Well, I think what we're saying is that's an externally imposed restriction. And therefore, unless the government said, right, okay, we're going to remove that restriction, then that's the value of the land that you would put in. So you're valuing it at this point in time, not for the potential in this case. And then there's a question about the actual structure that you put on that. That's a different, again, that's a different thing that you would put a new, you'd be valuing a new build hospital on that site, which is why I wanted to get clarification from staff on that, because then there is a question, Camira's point is possibly about impairment, if the old building's very run down or whatever. So I just want to get clarification on that point from staff before I go to Todd.
So I agree with you, Ian and Camira, if the building is run down or, yeah, you take impairment into account. I don't know if that answers the question, or David, whether you have more to add.
Well, I think, I mean, the point is that normally the restrictions are going to be on the land, because it's going to be the land that restricts what you can put on it. So that's the land restrictions are normally externally imposed. On the question of the land of the building, then yeah, it could be that the state of the building is indicative of impairment. But equally, if you're looking at a modern equivalent asset, if we dare go back to that, one of the obsolescence factors would take the modern equivalent asset down to the state of the existing asset. So you would reflect it, that there would be a reduction in value reflected that in that way.
Okay, thanks for that, David. So back to Todd.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on what Adrienne was saying. I think the restriction on the land for, say, use as a hospital would affect the fair value of that land if you wanted to try and sell that land. But if we're looking at sort of the operational value, then you're looking at what it would be to replace that land. And so that's why I think it would have a higher value than it would under fair value.
I mean, essentially, the being able to access the market value is essentially what we've got under ED 79, isn't it? That you've cleared the ability, you can dispose of it and all that kind of thing. So therefore, you can access fair value. What we're talking about here is use. It's zoned for use as a hospital. You value it as a hospital in that location. Okay, so I think basically we're supporting the staff recommendation here. Leslie.
Yes, thank you, Chair. But I just want to relate this issue on this C4, wherein we on modern equivalent asset, and we were discussing about the obsolescence. I think we have to, in addition to the three obsolescence that were mentioned in C4, I think we have to include legal obsolescence, because that would also be considered as legal restrictions on modern equivalent assets. So aside from physical obsolescence, functional and economic. I think that those were the those were the three types of obsolescence discussed in C4. I think we have to consider also legal obsolescence of a modern equivalent asset.
David, perhaps you can clarify. I'm not sure I'm getting that point.
Yeah, no, it's fine, Ian. Any of those sorts of restrictions, Lucy, come under the third category of economic or external obsolescence.
Okay. Mike, and then I'm going to move us on to the next issue, because I think we're agreeing with staff on this.
Yeah, so thanks, Chair. I just want to clarify just what we are agreeing. So I'm happy with the recommendation, as long as I said earlier, it doesn't result in the valuation of the asset going down. So if the first one says include legal restrictions in the measurement of the asset using operational value, what does that actually mean?
It means that if the land is zoned for use as a hospital, you value it as a hospital in that location.
Okay, and the second one? It includes social policy objectives in the measurement?
That's how that's similar to what Ian just said. If you're operating the asset as a hospital, you'd value it as a hospital.
Yes, it's because the social policy is to continue to use it as a hospital. Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Mike. So I think with that, let's move on to issue 7.
So issue 7 is the terminology income approach. Staff was asked to look at the term income approach and determine whether it accurately reflected what the income approach is trying to show as a measurement technique. Staff looked at some alternatives, but again, ultimately ended up with income approach, not necessarily because it's the best description of what income approach reflects, but because there's consistency with IFRS 13, there's consistency with the IVS community, and it just seemed like we'd be changing the term that a lot of people are already familiar with. So I'll leave it to members' comments.
Thanks, Dave. And I think with that proposal goes that there would need to be a discussion of the fact that the board has considered this, and a reflection of some of the concerns there, but why we'd come to that view on balance. Okay, so anybody disagree with staff's conclusions on that, Mike?
I don't disagree with the conclusion, Ian. I just wanted to ask, in addition to BCs, do we need an SMC?
I think we might end up with so many SMCs. Let's see where we get to. I mean, we're going to have an SMC on the income approach anyway, so I think let's wrap it up with that. Camira.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Well, I disagree with the staff recommendation, but okay, yeah, I accept it. And I will also support having an SMC on that if it's possible. So thanks.
Okay, so let's look at the wording of the SMC in due course when we've had the next discussion. And acknowledge your concerns, Camira. And I think we do need to acknowledge those in BCs that it's an on-balance thing based on not wanting to take a different, use a different term, because it's actually in conventional usage. Okay, so let's then move on to issue 8. And here, this was where last time we agreed that we would put this in, but that we would need to ask an SMC and explain our reasoning on this. Dave, over to you.
So I don't have much to add. I worked with members on both sides who shared, I'll say, opposing views. I guess from the board perspective, I just wanted to make sure that I reflected the arguments appropriately, and this is what we reflect in the BCs, and we've drafted an SMC as well. Okay, thanks, Dave. And I think you've worked both with Lynn and Todd on this. So I'll go first to Mark.
Thank you, Ian. As you know, I was not present last week on the discussion. It was interesting to read and to see their opposing views. Maybe to share my personal view on this, I'm also tend to be in those members opposing the view, because I just cannot see, based on these arguments, how the income you can derive from an asset, from the use of an asset, should be the amount to replace the asset. I think it's independent of each other, what you can get from the asset and what it costs to replace, because replacing also always means there is a third party you have to acquire it, and even if you produce it by yourself, you would need to have input factors based on some external price. So this is just my opinion, so that you know, for transparency reasons. But now a little bit coming from the view that we have made in the introduction, but what the section about valuations. So I asked myself, which I think was very useful, because now I ask myself, what actually do the valuers say? Is it possible to use the income approach for an operational value, instead of asking the constituents who might, as us, have opposing views, but actually may not know it? Because what do the valuers say? That would be of interest.
Okay, I'll come back to staff and ask for clarification on that. I'll take comments from Patricia and Camira.
I have thought about the argument favor the income approach, but for me it's very difficult to identify how to use the income approach, considering that there is the measurement, the measure for the operational capacity, and the cash generated is not primary objective. And consequently, it's very difficult to have a similar measure using a cost, market, and income approach. And because the concept, definition of the operational value is estimate amount to replace, and not and consequently, when I for example, in the example in point A, I think I have the estimate amount received to finance the replacement. I think it's other things, because this, I think, my view is I'm not supporting the income approach, but I agree with the SNC. Really, I can't see the use of the income approach in the context.
In proposing the way forward that I did the other day, let's be clear, we have a clear difference of opinion within the board on this, and this is a handling approach. It's not the end of the debate. It's saying that we have a disagreement within the board on this for very perfectly reasonable positions that members are taking, but we should allow ourselves the opportunity to use it or not use it based on the feedback that we get on the circumstances that our constituents see. So by including it, we keep that option available and we reflect the difference of views in the board. It's the same as we've done in ED 78 by including the fair value approach there. By exposing it and including it, we leave ourselves open the option of either retaining or deleting when we come to the final standard. So it's a handling approach at this stage. And in taking that approach, the proposal is that we do expose the different views and that we do ask the specific matter for comment. So without redeliberating whether members support or don't support, can we just have the discussion about how it's been represented? So I've got Camira, Todd and Lindy.
Thanks, Chair. I disagree with the arguments provided in the first to support the views of including the income approach, because it reflects like the budget constraints are having an impact, a direct impact in measurement, and that's too dangerous to in the way we are proposing it. So that's an argument in favor, because budget constraints are the day-to-day of our public sector institutions. And if we are saying that, okay, because the entity doesn't has the budget, then that would be the ceiling of the value we will assign to an asset, that's really dangerous. On the other hand, I will propose as an argument in favor of including the income approach. I think the income approach could be very useful in terms, for instance, in measuring heritage assets when we have no clue of how to measure it, but at least we have cash flows. For instance, I don't know, Colosseum or something like that, that you really do not know. Let's not talk about the land, but in itself, the structure of the heritage asset. At least you have inflows and outflows that can let you estimate a floor, like the bottom line for, you can derive like, okay, at least you know that asset could have a value of at least this. Deriving the income approach in this sense, it could be helpful. So maybe we can incorporate that as an argument, that instead of the budget constraint one. So thanks.
Okay, thanks, Tamira. So Todd, Lindy, and Lynn.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think a lot of this comes down to being clear about what we mean by the operational value of an asset. And I think, as I've said, if this is about replacing the asset, then I don't think the income approach is appropriate in that context. And I was very interested in Lynn's comments quite early on in the meeting today that maybe if there is a place for the income approach, it's not through the way that we're currently defining operational value. So it's it's a bit of a sticking point for me, really, to have the income approach in this measurement basis when it's all about replacing the asset, because it just doesn't work at a conceptual level for me that that's a possibility.
Okay, well, I'll take Lindy and then ask Lynn to respond on that, and then I'm going to staff. Lindy.
Thank you. And my comment is probably a bit of a process issue. So I don't disagree that we've put one forward and we have these alternative views or different views in the basis for conclusions. I guess my comment then is, how do you frame it? Because as Kamira said, I've also got comments on both the text, but because it's in the BCs, is it a board view? Because it's different if it's an alternative view outside where it's one member's view and you are responsible for what you put in here. But now it's in the BC. So do we edit these or do we clarify or put some context to it? Because we could go round and round, and I could also raise questions on this, but I don't think that's what we intend to do. We want to put these two views forward, but putting them forward in the BCs means there's more than just one, I guess, that has this view or not. That's just my question. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'll ask for advice from Ross in a minute. Lynn, you put your flag down. Did you want to say anything at all?
Sorry, not intentionally. I wanted to say something. I think it does come back to what I said earlier in the meeting, which is, I think where the difference in view is actually about what we mean by what we're now calling operational value. I think most of the board from the discussion think that operational value is only replacement cost. That's where I think the view differs from my perspective. And I do feel if we think it is replacement cost, then we ought to be calling it replacement cost. If we think it's the operational value towards my, is this asset, what is this asset contributing to me in achieving my objectives, then I think the income approach is appropriate. If we mean replacement cost by operational value, then I think we should be much more clear about that. And I do have a question mark then, is actually, I think it's a more fundamental point then, is operational value or replacement cost the right measure when we've got assets that do generate income for us, even if we're not holding them for financial capacity. So I think actually my point is more perhaps a higher level than we've ended up articulating this. I think the way we ended up articulating this was a compromise, but I think it's a bit more fundamental about, for me, what do we mean by operational value when you have assets that do generate income and are achieving your objectives.
Thanks, Lynn. What I want to do is just go to staff first on both the points that have been raised, the valuation approach and also the process question, and then I'll go to Bernard and Mark. So perhaps if I can take Dave first and then go to Ross.
I think from a valuation perspective, I think Lynn's right. I think the board needs to land exactly what we think this measurement basis is trying to present. I guess what staff was trying to do was move away from replacement cost. One of the comments that our constituents raised in response to the CP is that we had replacement costs at two different levels, one at the measurement base level and one as a measurement technique under fair value. So while operational value shares some characteristics with replacement cost, it was not supposed to be replacement cost.
Thanks, Dave. Ross.
Thanks. On the process issue, it really depends on where things land. So if we want an alternative view, or if a member wants an alternative view, according to due process, you have to vote against the pronouncement, and then after work with staff to articulate your particular view. Now that can be one or more members voting against it, but you need at least one member to vote against to actually elevate what's discussed in the BCs to an alternative view. So that is an option in due process. So I guess it depends. I think in most cases in our BCs, the board comes to a consensus view. Sometimes there's a member or two that has an alternative thought on the view that we'd express, that to make sure constituents know of the discussion, but we'd clearly land on a consensus view. Sometimes when those views are so strong for a member, they feel the need to vote against it so they can fully articulate their alternative view more fulsome, so that those constituents who might have a similar view are aware of what's being discussed. So it really comes down to where members land on that. If we have members with multiple alternative views, I think that's more problematic. I think we have to settle one way or another on the consensus view, and if there's an opposition view, I think we need some consensus on what those opposition points are. I think it would look rather odd to have multiple different alternative views on that. So that's where it stands process-wise.
Thanks, Ross. And I think it's probably helpful to remind the board that the time that as a board we deliberately put two views out because we wanted to move the project forward, but there was a genuine disagreement, was in the context of social benefits. And there we had a very deliberate handling approach that we would have an alternative view, because there was a fundamental difference. Either you just have a provision for a timing difference, or you put a liability for future payments on the balance sheet. So it's hugely significant. It was the crux of the debate, and basically there was no agreement. Both sides had their own views, and that was why in that case we went with the view in the ED that was in favour of, it was just around the timing difference, versus in the alternative view, and that was that was a deliberate tactic amongst the board. So those who favoured the alternative view did, as Ross said, they voted against. So we had a number of members voting against the ED, and then that was explained in the alternative view, which they worked up with staff. So we have that. We have that option. The alternative view has also been used in the conceptual framework, in the measurement chapter indeed, where one of the board members felt strongly that we should have a measurement objective, and actually that was supported by constituents, and so therefore that went into the final measurement chapter, and that's what we have there. So you can see that the use of an alternative view is you know, an entirely reasonable way of taking you know, an argument out to constituents, and then it allows us to respond appropriately when we hear the comments back. And we've gone both ways. So social benefits, we went with the board view in the exposure draft. In the case of the conceptual framework, we included the measurement objective as a result of support from constituents. So that's just some context in terms of how we've used that in the past. So I'm going to take a few more comments from members at this stage. So over to Bernard.
Thanks, Ian. I'm just wondering a bit whether our differences actually are not coming from different views on public financial management, to be honest. And I think there's rightfully so a variety, countries doing it quite differently. And some might prioritize the income you can generate and still hold the assets for operational purposes, right? They don't want to sell it off and those kinds. But if they can operate it in two ways and one give them more income, they're gonna go for the second one, right? And I mean, I can see this having, you know, a small application area also where, like Kamira said, you might have sort of user-financed assets where the only kind of reliable or traceable source of information might be what people are willing to pay kind of to consume the asset. And if that's kind of functioning as a proxy for, you know, what could be the cost behind that, I mean, I could see this as a partial way of approaching it. I mean, I wouldn't expect it to be the, you know, the first order of measurement in that sense, and I would assume that there are other data sources available which might be more reliable. But there might be circumstances actually where you know, there is an application area, and I'm not sure if kind of the conflict we are having conceptually is kind of worse, you know, the discussion, to be honest, in some areas. I do see the conceptual points that you made. I mean, I totally acknowledge it wouldn't be my first shot on measuring those operational values using income, but I can see really minor application areas for that. And again, I think it also depends on how you manage your finances as a government, and I'm not sure if we have to take sides on this.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. I think it's important. It's a good reminder about it should come back to that sort of question about, and that fits within our overall objective of strengthening public financial management through the implementation of IPSAS. Go to Mark, and then Lindy, and then back to Dave.
Listening to the conversation, I still see that we struggle, obviously, and Lynn has already said to what is the current service value, what do we mean? And this may be also the place where because I struggle, because as it's defined now, we say it's the amount required to replace an asset. So automatically, because the word replace is there, you would rather look at from the way as replacement cost, and that is actually how I look at it. And that's why I struggled with the example of the toll bridge, which has only a low income, and then you, as the amount required to replace the same toll bridge, you would then use the low income, and have a really low value. But in fact, coming from the definition, you have to replace the asset, so you have to and the cost of this bridge is not related to the income, as my members has said. So that's why my question was a little bit, what would a valuer then say if you say, okay, you will tell a valuer what we mean with the current service value, and would the valuer say this is the amount to replace the asset? Would the valuer then say, okay, the income approach under this definition is feasible? And this was actually my question, which I would be interested in. Maybe David, what would be your opinion, or what would the valuer say?
Okay, thanks, Mark. I'll just take Lindy, and then we'll go back to Dave and David, and then I'll sum up where I think we've got to in this discussion.
Thank you. And just going back to my question, so I understand the alternative view approach. My question is, for example, if I look at the view that is supporting the income approach, I have a different justification for it. So do we have to get consensus on this justification that's in the BCs? Or do we just, okay, that's one member and we leave it like that? Because I think some of us have comments on what's in the BCs. So do we get a consensus on the content in the BCs, both options? Or do we then just in the BCs put the context that says, well, this is one view of the member as opposed to two consensus alternative views, if I'm explaining myself correctly.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Lindy. So I think, I mean, I think where I think we probably, no, I'll take Lynn and then I'll sum up what I think probably the way forward is get staff to provide clarification, and then we'll just have a discussion at that stage. So Lynn, I'll take your comment first.
So I think the BCs are not explaining at the moment the difference in views adequately. When I read the bridge example, I don't disagree with the cost approach being appropriate in the bridge example. Mine is a higher level disagreement, and I think we could write it differently. I'm more than happy to spend more time with staff to write it differently. I think it comes from the fundamental point about how do you value operational value for an asset that you are holding for its income potential.
Thanks, Lynn. So, I mean, I think this has actually been a very helpful discussion, because I think it's clarified the problem we're having, really, which is that if you essentially believe that you know, it's appropriate to include the option of you know, income where you're using it for operational purposes. And I know I keep coming back to the example I'm familiar with, which is social housing, where, you know, you can value on the basis of the rental stream, which would be below a market value, but it would be valued for social housing in a particular location. If we think that should be included in this as a measurement technique for this basis, and let's not put a label on it, let's not define it just yet. I think that takes you one way then in terms of how you define it and how you label it. If you want it to be something that's essentially closer to replacement cost, then I think that takes you to another place. And it strikes me that actually this may well be an example of where we probably just need to actually get a sense of where, you know, sorry, take a step back. I think this is one where there is actually a legitimate, you know, for the reasons that Bernard has very properly explained, it's about the view that you take on the public financial management perspective. So therefore, as a board, it may well be helpful that we actually decide tactically, we will have an alternative view on this. And that can be in either direction, depending on, you know, which position the majority of the board takes. But I think if we're agreed that we want to move this project forward, then what we need to do is actually have, you know, one or two members who will sponsor that alternative view to get it out there. And then to Lindy's point, then the drafting, I think, follows from that. The name that we're proposing, the definition that we're proposing follows from that, but it's equally clear what the alternative would be. In, you know, what the alternative is explained in the alternative view. So as a board, if we believe we want to move this project forward and that we should get this out for input from our constituents, then taking that alternative view route, you know, providing we get a majority voting for the exposure draft would allow us to get that argument out. We can get the feedback, and then we take the final decision based on feedback from constituents. And I think that probably would come back to Bernard's point there. It depends on the view that people are taking in terms of, is this just a replacement cost and we need to allow for the, you know, an income approach some other way, or so I just want to go back to Ross on the process. And David, on anything else in terms of the valuation?
Again, so maybe back to the comment Lindy was making as well. I think regardless of where we land on any of this discussion, we need to reflect the board's thinking in the BCs. And that includes, you know, all of the points the board lands on from a consensus perspective. And that can be done following the approval. The BCs are not authoritative text. So if you have comments we need reflected, we can work on that after the fact. Same with the alternative view. So in terms of the process to make sure it goes smoothly, if once the board decides on how it wants to take it forward in terms of the options that Ian discussed, we'd in advance of the vote, we'd want to determine who the sponsors of that alternative view would be and make sure they vote against it. And it's recorded as such, and then we'll note that in the alternative view and work with those members to make sure that we clearly articulate that alternative view. And on the flip side, work with the rest of the board to make sure the BCs on the view we land on is expressed in a manner the board's comfortable with. So I can appreciate, Lindy, at the moment you might not be completely convinced by the views supporting it, but all at this point we need to know is what those views are that you'd like to see added, and if other members are agreeing, we can put those in.
Okay, thanks for that, Ross. Dave or David, anything else we should just add at this stage? And then I just want to have a discussion in terms of, are people happy with that as a handling approach to move us forward?
I think the only point I'd make is this. I agree with your point, Ian, a couple points ago where you talked about we have to clarify whether this is more of a replacement cost or a different valuation. I agree with that in the context of the discussion we had where we focused on income. But going to Kamira's point on the last paper, I don't think the income approach necessarily just covers income. It's a present value technique for cash flows. So that can be income or expenses. So I just want to highlight that in the context of this discussion as well, because if you have future outflows, those are also included in a income approach, which may be more applicable in a replacement cost measurement.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So I just want to have a discussion now. So the proposal is that we move this forward using an alternative view, and that whichever is the majority view within the board goes into as a board proposal, whichever is the minority position goes in as the alternative view. But we need to make sure that we're happy with that approach as a board as a way of moving this forward. So I just want to take comments and make sure people are happy with that as a way of moving the issue forward. And that's, you know, are you happy with that approach, regardless of whether your view ends up in or out of the paper? I think this is a public interest issue. Rod.
Thanks, Chair. Well done. I'm very comfortable with that approach, and thank you for that. I do have one clarification question for Ross, if I might. And Ross, when an exposure draft is approved, does it require a majority board approval or a 2/3 board approval?
Great question, Rod. It requires 12 of the 18 members to vote, and it's not based on the quorum of the meeting. It's 12 of the members, regardless of the amount of members that are present.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. So I'll go to Todd, then Lynn, then Thomas.
Thanks, Ian. I agree with the approach that you're suggesting. I felt uncomfortable with the way that the basis for conclusions was looking. It didn't feel right to me. So I think it would be better if we aren't agreed at the end of this that there is an alternative view, whichever way around that goes. And I think my views are fairly well known already on this one. So I'm the one alternative view 2, I think, in the paper.
Sorry. So Lynn, then I'll take Scott as a board member before I go to Thomas as chairman of the CAG. So Lynn.
So I'm happy with the proposed way forward. I would like to be the board sponsor for the alternative view. How we express the alternative view may be different depending on where we get to on the operational value definition.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, I mean, I just want to get the overall handling, and then we'll go back and have that debate. Scott.
Yeah, I almost put my hand down. My comment was going to be around Lynn's comment. I think the alternative view will depend on how we decide the other issue, and that is operational versus that. So our alternative view needs to be aligned with the way we decided about operations and replacement. That's my only point.
Thanks, Scott. Thomas, are you going to talk about process? I'm not in for comments on either approach at the moment. I just want to get the view on process. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I understood that. Just process-wise, from a public interest perspective, I think I would support that from a CAC perspective, because I think it's a very open and transparent procedure, kind of showcasing to outside stakeholders how the opinion building process went in the board. So I would kind of really support this this approach as suggested.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. So I think with that, I'm hearing support from members for the alternative view approach. And just to be clear, this is a handling approach. So, you know, what we're trying to do is make sure we've got at least 12 board members that would support the issue of the document. That's not necessary, you know, so I'm just going to take a show of hands in terms of those that would favour the inclusion of the income approach as the board view, and those that don't support that, literally just that, and then we'll sort the handling out and the debate about definitions and what we call it and so on, consequential from that. Okay, so Ross, you ready to count hands on this? So if I can have a show of hands for those who favour the inclusion of the income approach as a measurement technique for this current value basis.
So I'm counting the virtual hands. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 virtual hands.
Okay. So can I have a show of hands for those who don't support its inclusion?
So I've got 6, 7. Can I just clarify again on the first vote? Because Lindy, you did a thumbs up on the screen, but I'm not sure I saw your hand go up in the virtual hand. So we might be talking 9 and 7 here.
Okay, so can we just go back and clarify that? Because obviously this is very close. So those in favour of the inclusion of the income approach, please indicate with the raised hand function.
So I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
You're not allowed to show both hands, Michelle.
Yeah, 9. I've got 9.
Right. Okay. And can we just, for the record, just do the those who don't support inclusion use the raise hand function.
I've got 6.
So do we have a couple of members who haven't expressed a view then on this?
So I think Nima's been dropping in and out of the meeting. So I don't think is here right now. And we don't have James.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we must have a couple members who haven't voted for one of these. Do we have anyone who's abstaining?
I mean, I think this is where it comes back to my comment about handling. I think in terms of which view we have in, it clearly is very narrow. And I think we have to go with a simple majority on this. But in terms of the vote, so the alternative view coming out of that show of hands would be on the income approach, which Todd has agreed that he would sponsor. What we need to be clear on, though, as a board, is if that's the sole issue, that people are disagreeing on, that we need a majority who will support the issue of the standard. Whether we have several members supporting that alternative view, that's fine, but we need to make sure that we've got at least 12 members who would be content to vote to get the standard issued, with the those members who want to support the alternative view working with staff on drafting that. Mike.
Yeah, so Chair, I support whichever way I voted a moment ago. I support the need to issue the standards or this ED. So I think we should get the ED out. So if we're asking for a vote, I'll be one of those 12.
Okay, thanks on that. So I think what we need to do now, just in the remaining time that we've got, is go back to those opening issues in terms of what name do we give it, because we do need to give some direction to staff, but I think the context we've got shows why we were having such a challenge with the opening issues, as it were. So we need, as a board, to say, okay, if we are including the income approach, what are the proposals that would be consistent with that, recognizing that the alternative view will need to put, if we're excluding income, what would the alternative view be? Or views, if ultimately we have a disagreement of views as to what those are, in terms of the terminology or the definition. But I think it's more helpful for constituents if essentially they've got a choice of two views. One, this is with the income approach included, this is what we would get. This is what we would get if we exclude that. Okay. So I'm thinking that probably it would be helpful maybe if we did issue 2, which is let's give it a name, and then let's go back to issue 1 for a few minutes.
So issue 2, as I indicated in the paper, we tried a few different names. The challenge we ran into was they seem to be applied in practice in IVS, and we were trying to reduce confusion. We landed on operational value because I think this will be mostly applied when you are holding your assets for operational capacity.
Okay, can I just ask, bearing in mind the tactical approach we're now taking with getting this out, does anybody disagree with the proposal to call it operational value? Mike.
So Chair, I just had a small suggestion because it worries me that if I'm using the term operational value, am I in a fair value model or a historical cost model? And I wonder whether you shouldn't add the word current before operation. So current operational value, then it makes it clear that it's not historical cost.
Okay, I see some support for that. Bernard, you put your hand down. Were you going to make a similar point?
Yeah, that will be my point as well.
Okay. So are members content then if we go with current operational value? Okay. So we now have a name. So let's then go back to the issue where we started this morning, which was on what do we think the definition should be for this. Dave, just remind us then.
So what staff had proposed is that we focus on the estimated amount required to replace the asset in its current use.
Can I take comments on that? Lynn.
So it does come back to his fundamental point. How Dave mentioned earlier, he felt that was different to replacement cost. Could you just articulate why that's different to replacement cost?
So one of the big differences to me is that under replacement cost, I would argue you only have one measurement technique, which is the cost approach, whereas under current operational value, you have multiple measurement techniques in order to come up with the amount required to replace the asset.
Then back on that.
Can you explain why? Because I think that's dancing on the head of a pin rather than the concept. It's rather than the conceptual point to me. Is are we trying to get a measure of the operational value of the asset, to me the entity, or are we trying to get a measure of what it would cost to replace? Because the techniques kind of like follow after that, and I'm at a more fundamental level than the techniques.
So I don't know whether we're trying to get, well, I guess it depends what you mean by operational value, because I had originally thought operational value would focus more on the value of the service that the asset was providing. And I think we've definitely moved away from that, and we've moved back to focusing on valuing the asset. So maybe we've moved closer to replacement cost than we were last week.
Okay, can I just take comments from other members? So what we're trying to do is provide a definition for current operational value, and that clearly has moved the debate away from strictly we're purely replacing this asset. I just want to get a sense then from the other members who want to come in on this. So I've got Todd, Bernard, and then Patricia.
In my view, this very much is about replacing the asset, and that's been quite central to the way that we have been defining this particular measurement base. And so if we're now throwing that up and saying that it's not about replacing the asset, then a whole lot of the other conversations we've been having could get unwound, I think. But in my mind, it is about replacing the asset, and it's for the service potential of the asset rather than the economic benefits of the asset, if you like.
Okay, I'll take Bernard, Patricia, and then Lynn.
Thank you. I don't have a proposition of the wording, but given the debate we had earlier, I kind of miss, or I think if we don't want to be too close to replacement cost, if that feels too close, I think we have to bring in somehow this question on how does it contribute to the operations. This could be by the use of the asset itself, but it also could be by the income or the expenses which are associated with the assets and the way they're used for the service. I don't have a wording, but I think that's kind of, I guess, where we have to be able to phrase or have a good narrative if we want to argue for a broader basis than just replacement cost.
Okay, thanks, Bernard. I'm going to take other comments on this, and then I don't think we're going to come to a landing on this in this session, but I think we've got sufficient strategic direction that I think your comments then come into play. So I take Patricia and then Lynn.
Thank you. I think when we exclude the potential services, it's more difficult to understand the concept, but I understand the issues presenting in relation the conceptual framework in the next steps. But in my view, replacement cost is one of the way to look for the amount to replace. It's not the only one. In my opinion, the main characteristics related to this measurement is because it is entity specific. It's a main and the mainly about the cost of service. For example, I would like to know not what cost based on the cost approach, but what it would cost for handling the services, because this I would now how the amount that I use necessary to replace the service of the assets, because this I think income is not appropriate here. But replacement is for similar, and reproduction is all the way to achieve the amount to replace, and market approach, the value in the market is all the way to verify the amount to replace, because this is a difference in the replacement cost and the operational value. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. So that sort of moves us a bit back towards services, but in the context of this particular asset. And that might be worth sort of thinking about, because I think that goes a bit towards what Bernard was saying, but we need to be careful not to open up that direction too widely, because then that would go into the problem that when we were calling it, current service value, that was causing a problem for members too. But actually, I think that that sort of sense of what you were talking about there, Patricia, might well be quite helpful for staff to have a think about in terms of proposing a possible way forward. I'll take Lynn, and then I think probably we need to finish the session this morning.
Thanks, Ian. And I think to my mind, just picking up on what everybody's just said, is if operational value is some sort of valuation to me, the entity, of what this is worth to me in its existing use to contribute to my objectives, if that's what we're driving at, there could be multiple ways of measuring that. Income approach, replacement cost being two of multiple different ways of measuring that. And I guess that's sort of the crux of where I guess I'm at on this, that if it's replacement cost we're trying to measure, then I think we've got a different problem. But I feel that this measure is about what is this asset, what's the value to me of this asset in its existing use contributing to my objectives. Replacement cost might be one way of showing me that, but I think there are other ways as well.
Okay, thanks. So I think we need staff to take what members have just said away, and I think that has been, a range of helpful interventions that shows us the sort of space we need to be in on this. So I think, thanks for that. I think we will hold the paper that we haven't taken, the issue about how we deal with service potential, because I think that's kind of contingent on where we go in defining current operational value. So I think we need staff to go away and have a think about the option or options for defining current operational value. I think then we have a couple of relatively minor issues that we haven't yet talked through. So my proposal would be that we let staff come back with some proposals on the definition, and if possible that we do that overnight, so that we can then just clear through the remaining issues at the start of the session tomorrow. Now, I'm also conscious that we haven't got onto the conceptual framework review. We do have a bit of extra time tomorrow, I think, because we probably won't need the full time on leases. So my suggestion would be that we tomorrow deal with the remaining issues. We go back to the subject twos on leases and just deal with those. Then we deal with the remaining issues on ED77, and also have a further proposal from staff on what the definition might be. and that might be a couple of options, or it might be an option. Leave that to staff, and then we go. Then we walk through the ED76, and particularly we'll need to have a look at the material on basis for conclusions there. Okay, so thanks everyone. That I think has been, I think we have got to the core of why we were having so many problems. So I think that's been really helpful. We've clearly got some things to do to work this through, but I think this morning's been a really important morning for us. We do have a handling approach. We will have an alternative view to take the income approach argument out to constituents. So again, I think that's really helped us. So with that, I think I close today's session and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. So thanks everyone.
Bye everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Have a good rest.